Hello everyone, it is February 18th, 2025. It's Tuesday. It's Harp Tuesday! Welcome to this week's episode. So today I want to wax philosophic a bit and just talk about learning and how our minds can be very useful, but also can be a bit of a detriment. And if there's one big takeaway, it's kind of this idea that it can pay to kind of quiet our minds and trust the process. So if you think, one example of very accomplished learners are little babies, right? Learning to walk, learning to talk. And how amazing, right? They certainly don't go about it maybe very efficiently. If you compare what we could do with our adult brains or whatever to analyze things and come up with strategies and ideas, but they achieve these tremendous things in part because they don't have this adult brain sort of saying, well, this is taking a while. Have you got there yet? I don't know. And being afraid and scared of mistakes and just that they just keep doing things. And you think about learning a language, right? I think, and I speak as someone who only speaks one language, but I think a lot of adults struggle with learning a language. And of course, there are physiological advantages that a young baby has and a young child has. And of course, that immersion factor. But also, again, that idea of not worrying about mistakes, that a baby starts trying to communicate as soon as they can, right? And oftentimes, maybe if we're learning a language, there can be sometimes a hesitancy to engage in speaking that language. Whereas my understanding is that's one of the most effective ways to learn is to, as soon as possible, start to try to speak that language, to communicate, to talk to somebody in a different language. And of course, you'll make mistakes. And so, yeah, at some point, sometimes we learn or maybe get this idea that mistakes are a character failing, that mistakes are evil and doing it correctly is good somehow. Whereas mistakes are great, right? Like just to not be afraid to experiment and try and fail and try again and fail and try again. And again, as an adult, we often have this maybe timeline in mind, or we want results, right? We're like the little child taking the seed out of a garden to see, has it sprouted yet? Has it growing yet? And we just have to trust the process, to quiet our mind and trust the process. And I came across a nice quote the other day that we tend to overestimate what we can do in the short term and underestimate what we can do in the long term. And I think that's very true, that we want those short-term results, and when we don't get them, sometimes it means that we stop. And so we then don't see the other side of that. We don't see how much you can achieve over a slightly longer term. And so when I think about music, I think about learning a new piece of music. It can seem really intimidating at the beginning. And I did a Harp Tuesday episode several years ago talking about this idea of learning new things and why that can seem so hard. And this idea of, sort of the mountain or the molehill, that when we encounter something new, that's the hardest point. And it can feel like, whoa, it's going to be this huge climb up this very steep mountain to get to the end. And sometimes it can be really hard, but a lot of the time, once we get over that initial hurdle of learning something new, it becomes much, much easier. And we look back and think, whoa, that was so easy. What were we stressed about, right? And so, and again, this idea that when we're trying to learn something new, it's going to require a lot of mental effort, and maybe there's a tendency to, not consciously, but just as a humans, to want to preserve some of that energy and not engage in that effort. And so for me, that's why often I find psychologically it can be a boon to get through the entire piece. If I'm learning a new piece that's long and hard, to maybe each day start from where I left off. I'm not going to get through the whole thing that day, but just to psychologically know I can get through the whole piece. I'm aware of the kind of the shape of the whole piece, and then maybe start to dig in different spots. Or for example, learning as well as the beginning of the piece, maybe the end of the piece, so that trying to counter that effect that often can happen is you know the beginning of a piece quite well and it's fun to play and and going further starts to become harder and harder because it's such a contrast from the part you know well to the stuff that you have to learn that's new to you. So by learning the end and the beginning, you kind of have a pathway from here to there that maybe makes it less intimidating. Again, that our minds in this case are kind of doing us a disservice by thinking about getting distracted by sort of the end product. I remember I have a brother who's a percussionist, and years ago I think one of his teachers said something along the lines of, today you practice the paradiddle, and tomorrow you practice the paradiddle, and the next day, and kind of this idea that yes, of course you can think about, you're practicing something, maybe you're working on trills, and okay, is it feeling relaxed? Does it kind of look the way you want it to? Is it sounding at all the way you want it to? But not getting too caught up in measuring it every day. Again, like pulling out that seed to see if it's grown. That this, our brains are so good at analyzing and looking for patterns and trying to see progress. But sometimes you just step back and you trust that you're on the right path and that you're doing the right process, and you just do that process and let it happen. And of course, there's no guarantees in life, right? There's no guarantees. You might work on trills for a year and they would certainly get better, but that doesn't mean they're going to be, absolutely perfect. But certainly by engaging in that process, you give yourself your best chance of that progress. And yeah, so thinking about our minds, and I had a couple examples then also of that idea of our mind will often fight against something that's hard, right? And so I'm working on the Renier Legende right now. I've played it many, many, many times, and there's one section in it that I'm changing the fingering. I'm doing actually what she suggests, which is to have the left hand take a different note than I was before. And as I was starting that change, I had the feeling that the end result would be better. But in the moment, because I know the piece well, right? It's not like I'm learning the whole thing from scratch. That stood out, right? Like I could play the surrounding bit quite well, and then suddenly, this just wasn't flowing, and that can be kind of irritating, and so, or a bit frustrating. And it's easy for the mind to say, well, why don't you just do it the way you know that you can? And of course, it's possible that maybe you try a different fingering and it doesn't work out, and maybe you've wasted that effort. But I think, like, if you make that choice, if you think, I think this is probably going to be better, or even if you think, well, I think this might be better, then you kind of have to trust that process and quiet the mind and just engage and get it to the point where you can make an informed decision about whether it's better, and not get caught up in the sort of the momentary annoyance of it not flowing as well as it could if you did the way you were used to doing it. And I see that also, for example, with people coming to the harp from the piano. If you play the piano quite well, it can be a huge advantage, right? You come to the harp and you can read both clefs, you can coordinate both hands, you often have a finger independence that can translate, and yes, it's a huge step up, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because you also have these expectations. Here's this instrument that seems and plays a lot like the piano, and so you get pianists, I mean, this is my experience of some people coming to the harp from the piano, and they look at the music and they say, oh, this would be so easy on the piano, why am I struggling so much? And they get discouraged. If you were learning the violin coming from the piano, it would be clear this is a totally new instrument. And of course it's going to take time, maybe, it could take years to get a good sound even. And whereas the similarity kind of trips you up. and makes you think, oh, it should be easy, and yet it is a different instrument. And actually, the harp is a very easy instrument to start to learn, but it is quite a challenging instrument to play well, like hard, fast stuff. And so again, our expectations are doing us a disservice. That we have to again kind of quiet the mind and just trust the process, and trying to somehow welcome challenges rather than fight against them. So I was thinking of the last episode. I was talking about muffling, and I was mentioning this Salzedo Good King Wenceslas arrangement that has a bunch of muffling like this or something along those lines, and that type of thing can be quite annoying because you could play it quite well a different way. And so it's easy to kind of reject that idea. Why do I have to play this sort of slowly, and I can't express it the way I want to because I'm doing this other type of thing? But if we can somehow mentally flip that around and say, this is a challenge, this is cool. Of course I could play this other way and it would be easy, but I want to see if I can do it this way and have it be easy, that challenge. So sort of embrace that challenge. And again, thinking about mistakes and whether you embrace challenge or not. So I think that sometimes, like learning new things, coming back to learning new things, sometimes there can be that idea of quitting before you can fail, before you lose, right? That, and again, it kind of doesn't make sense, but it also does make sense that if you're, like in school, for example, if you don't study something and fail that, you might ask, well, why didn't you study that? Why didn't you try, right? Because you knew you were going to fail if you didn't, so might as well try, and then maybe you'll succeed. Makes sense? But if you try and fail, then there's that sense that that's you are bad at that, or dumb, or you can't do that, right? That's maybe confirming that. Whereas if you quit, if you don't try, then of course you're going to fail, but you could have done it had you tried, right? And again, it's maybe not a conscious thought, but there can be that sometimes, approaching new things. And again, are you welcoming the challenge, which includes welcoming the fact that, yeah, you might fail, right? Or it might take longer than you ever wanted it to. And again, yes, absolutely, like you might fail. It might never feel comfortable. But of course, you're never gonna succeed without trying, right? Without trying. So yeah, so thinking about how we approach learning, and are we utilizing our brain to help us learn, or are there times when it is hindering our ability to learn, and where it's better to quiet the mind and trust the process? So I hope you enjoyed that. I will see you in a couple of weeks for another episode of Harp Tuesday. Cheers.